You're listening to episode 207 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author Alex Soojung-Kim joins us to speak about his book, The Distraction Addiction, getting the information you need and the communication you want without enraging your family, annoying your colleagues, and destroying your soul. Do you ever get distracted? If you're like me and practically everyone else on the planet, of course you do. And it's usually when you most want to not be distracted, like during meditation. Our practice may help us with that, but we also need to live in a world of distractions and understand our love affair with them. Alex Soojung-Kim is a visiting scholar at Stanford University and Oxford Said Business School. Previously, he held fellowships at Microsoft Research Cambridge, University of California, Berkeley, and Williams College. Alex has a PhD in History of Science from the University of Pennsylvania and is a senior consultant at Strategic Business Insights, a Silicon Valley think tank. His work has appeared in Scientific American, The Atlantic Monthly, American Scholar, Los Angeles Times, and many scholarly journals. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice raspberry zinger tea. And our guest today is Alex Soojung-Kim. Alex, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about your background.
My background is I'm a historian of science and technology by training, and professionally I work as a technology forecaster and futurist, but I've also had this sort of abiding interest in questions about technology and attention and the management of those two things. So on the personal side, I actually grew up in a whole bunch of different places. I was born here in California, which is where I live now, and grew up in Brazil for a few years because my father is an academic and a specialist in Latin American history. So we lived down there while he was going around to archives and reading papers about 19th century coffee growers. And I actually kind of grew up following my dad around from archive to archive. And some of my memories as a child involve hanging out in reading rooms while he read 19th century papers, and I would read J.R.R. Tolkien or some science fiction or something. And when I got to college, discovered history of science, and for me it was a really nice meeting point between an interest that I had in history and an interest I had in the sciences. And it felt like a field where I didn't really have to make any compromises I could sort of satisfy both of those interests. And then became one of the few people who gets a history of science degree and actually puts it to use in the business world as a technology forecaster and a futurist. That's a kind of work where you're asking exactly the same sorts of questions that you're interested in when you're studying, the social history of 19th century British science or, the cultural history of the atomic bomb. But you're just asking those questions of the future rather than the past. And so that experience of seeing that kind of very academic sort of training, those academic questions, could have a utility in dealing with sort of real world contemporary problems was something that ended up, I think, informing my work on contemplative computing and kind of running as part of the intellectual infrastructure of the distraction addiction. And then the question of what sort of effect do information technologies, do new communications technologies have on the way people think, the way that they argue, the way that they read, home and daily life. These are questions that people have been interested in for quite a long time. And is something that had been kind of a part of some of the work that I was doing as a technology forecaster. But it really became something that was very urgent a few years ago, because when you do futures and forecasting, it's really a kind of mix of research and then consulting. And so you're reading huge amounts of stuff across a wide variety of fields, lots of different technical stuff, popular stuff. Very often you have multiple projects going on simultaneously. And so there's an awful lot of juggling that you have to do. You read stuff fast, you try and digest it, you talk to a client about it, and then you move on to the next thing, almost before you can really kind of fully digest what you've, and really think through what you've read. And after doing that for 7 or 8 years, I hit this kind of mental wall. I was still able to do this. I could perform. But increasingly, I felt like the guy in the opening of Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. The person who could no longer read War and Peace because he spent too much time reading things that were 3 paragraphs long that let you click onto some other interesting thing that led somewhere else. And when you make a living off your ability to think seriously, the sense that that is starting to slip away from you is really very, very disturbing. It's sort of a flowers for Algernon moment. So I realized that this was something I really had to deal with. And so that's what inspired me to sort of start trying meditation, to develop a contemplative practice, and also at the same time, to try and think more deeply about what it is about these technologies, what it is about our relationship with them that is, on one hand, so incredibly promising and sometimes so fulfilling, but at the same time can also be toxic and addictive. And that led me into research on the neuroscience of attention, work that people like John Kabat-Zinn and Richard Davidson and people who are probably very familiar to you and your listeners have done on the neurology or neuroscience of meditation, and got me thinking about, all right, are there ways in which you can knit that work more closely together with efforts to deal with the specific problems of technology-generated distraction? And I got the opportunity to go to of all places, Microsoft Research Cambridge in the UK to do a sabbatical there. They have a program for visiting fellows. I met the head of the lab at a conference in Hungary in a couple of weeks, and we got along very well. And a couple of weeks later, kind of out of the blue, I got offered to come spend a few months there. And my wife, being a really very devoted Anglophile, said, we'll do whatever we have to make this work. So it really was very much a case of tremendous unexpected gift that the universe just kind of delivered at what felt like precisely the right time. And it gave me an opportunity to spend several months around people who design these technologies, who think really deeply about them, and to really get seriously into the question of, is it possible to practice what I started calling contemplative computing? Was it possible to use these technologies or even to design these technologies in ways that help us be more focused and mindful, that fulfill the promise of making us smarter and sometimes better people, rather than leaving us endlessly frustrated and mentally fractured and distracted? And so that sabbatical was what really convinced me that this was possible, that It gave me a chance to think through what that would look like and how you would go about practicing it, and put me far enough on that path to realize there's not just a kind of interesting article to be published in the proceedings of the IEEE, but there actually maybe is a book here. So that's how that project got started.
Fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about contemplative computing. What exactly is that? How do you define that? How do you outline that for people?
Right. I think first off, there were a whole bunch of things that you hear about with a word and then computing, right? There's ubiquitous computing, cloud computing, pervasive computing, and some of them are kinds of architectures, or they are services. Cloud computing is a good example of that. And contemplative computing is different from those in that it's not something that you buy, it's something that you learn how to do. And the central idea in contemplative computing is that it's possible to learn how to become more mindful while using these devices if you become more mindful about using them, become more mindful about them. And it also makes the argument that our relationships with information technologies can be incredibly powerful and incredibly deep. That when they are good, they are really, really good. It is as deep as the sort of experiences that we have when we're playing musical instruments really well, or that feeling of being connected to the road when you're in a really good car or a really good bicycle. That at its best, our relationships, our interactions with those technologies partake of that same kind of sense of merging with the device, of making ourselves able to express ideas, to go at a speed that we couldn't with our unassisted selves. And that sense of using these technologies in ways that extend our abilities, that make us better versions of ourselves, should be the goal of those interactions. Not simply to be able to email faster, or to be able to like more stuff, or to order things more quickly through the internet that get delivered to our door in an hour, but rather to expand our minds and to expand our abilities. Once you set that as the goal, and once you take on the idea that it's possible to pay attention to how you normally interact with these technologies and how they are designed to interact with you in certain ways, to capture your attention, to encourage you to spend more time with them, that is the first step to rebuilding that relationship, to thinking more clearly about not just how you're using them right now or how their designers want them to be used, but rather being able to ask yourself the question, okay, what do I really want to get out of this device or out of social media? And to be able then to say, all right, if I want this, what kind of practice, what sort of interactions do I have to have with this technology to make that so? So it's about reclaiming control over your technologies so that you can rebuild what philosophers would call your extended mind, the kind of broad mind that's defined not just by the processes that, the kind of neurochemical stuff that happens in your brain with, between your neurons, but rather the larger mind that exists between yourself, your body, and your devices. That extended mind is something that once you pay attention to, you can learn to improve and to take control of. And so contemplative computing is the set of practices that help you do that. Some of it is a kind of adaptation or use of the sorts of contemplative practices that we are all familiar with, whether it is through meditation practices that come from Buddhism and Zen, whether it's Lectio Divina or centering prayer from the Christian tradition. These are all things that can serve as a great first step toward becoming more aware of how you relate to your technologies, becoming aware of the kinds of desires and cravings they promote, and giving you the tools to begin to step away from that and to build a different kind of relationship with them. So you're probably familiar with the great saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice, right? That bad things happen in life. People come and go. We have to face our own mortality, illness, and setbacks. These are things that we cannot avoid. But what we can do is control how we react to them. We can choose to learn from them rather than simply suffer from them. And I think today, in our of always on high tech lives, many of us, especially if we're knowledge workers or professionals, it is impossible to do that kind of work, to live those sorts of lives absent information technologies. But it turns out that through things like contemplative computing, it's possible to back away from that state of permanent distraction and to recognize and act on the recognition that today connection is inevitable, but distraction can be a choice.
Yeah, is it a backing away from or a change of the relationship?
Well, let's say, maybe change in the relationship probably is the better term. This is an area in which the terms that we use to describe these relationships or the way we act upon them or act through them really does matter. People argue a lot about, for example, the term digital detox or, internet addiction. The question of whether talking about a digital detox implies that technologies therefore are toxic is really a pretty fraught thing. And I've interviewed people who run things like digital detox camps or centers and have asked them this question, so is this what you mean to convey? And their sense is, this is a phrase that people recognize. And yes, there is the risk of interpreting it that way. That's not how I mean it. I see the point, but it's too well established now to abandon. In my book, I talked about digital Sabbaths rather than digital detoxes precisely for this reason. And I thought that the term Sabbath was one that had, an obvious spiritual resonance that detox did not. And it allowed me to think about the subject and to take my thinking about it in a direction that I think I wouldn't have had I talked just about a digital detox.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the book, Distraction Addiction. What was it that prompted you to write about this particular topic?
Well, the main thing was that once I realized that there was something really substantive here, that I felt I had come up with a way of dealing with these issues that was really helping me. And it was a problem that people were recognizing, but people weren't solving. If you're familiar with books like Nicholas Carr's The Shallows or Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, I think those are both books that are really good at diagnosing a problem, at describing a set of dysfunctional relationships and anxieties and worries that plenty of people experience. Nick Carr's book has done really, really well because it speaks to a lot of people. It speaks to their own experiences. But I think where those books didn't go is into the arena of solutions. They were really good at describing what the problem was, but I felt after I read them, and they both coincidentally came out within a couple weeks of each other when I was at Microsoft Research, I came away from them with a sense of kind of cosmopolitan pessimism. I was really well informed about the neuroscience of attention and how it is that Facebook taps into dopamine receptors. But you finish that book and you have no sense, okay, of what you then do. And I think that there is a tendency when you invoke brain science to treat that as a kind of inevitability. That, if your brain is doing this, then there's no way you can resist your brain. Now, it turns out, of course, that interacting with the internet changes your brain is true, but it's less profound than it sounds because everything you do changes your brain. Every memory that you have, every movie you see, every book you read, every trip you take, all of those things literally change your brain, right? Certainly becoming a parent re-engineers your brain in all kinds of positive and, at least when you're not getting enough sleep, somewhat negative sorts of ways. But changing your brain is also something that you can do consciously. Anyone who goes to school, who learns a language, who learns to ride a bike, does that. And so it struck me that, okay, one of the things that I wanted to argue was that this idea of neuroplasticity, the idea that our brains change as we're exposed to new media, as we're exposed to new experiences, isn't a death sentence. It's not the mechanism through which technologies reach into the deepest recesses of our brains in ways that are inevitable and inaccessible to us, but rather neuroplasticity means if you feel like you've lost abilities, you can get them back. You can relearn how to pay close attention to things, how to read War and Peace again, assuming you ever read it the first time, which I will confess I actually have not. So I thought that the book filled a need in the market, but I also felt like if I could get this thing out, then that was the sort of opportunity sometimes that you have as a scholar and a writer that could be one of these irresistible signal points in your career and your life. If I could make this argument cogent and compelling, that was the sort of thing that you can proudly put on your epitaph. That's the really specific reason that I wrote it. It was also, the case that I happened to just get lucky and get connected to a really phenomenal literary agent, who worked really closely with me on the process of crafting the proposal and then did a great job selling it. So, she was the one who really made it possible for me to spend a year focusing on nothing but this. And, had that not been the case, then, we would probably be talking about a book I was planning to finish a year from now, rather than one that has been out for a year.
So tell us about the book itself, the premise. What's in there?
The book is organized around a set of practices. And each of these practices is connected to some underlying science that explains why they work and also illustrates some important aspect of our relationships with information technologies. So, for example, the first chapter is on breathing. And I use a phenomena called email apnea, which is a term that was invented by a Microsoft researcher named Linda Stone. She noticed that when people pull out their smartphones to check their mail or to do other kinds of things, wait for a web page to load, for example, something like 2/3 of them hold their breath. Now, this is not something that interface designers set out to do, right? No one said, okay, while this thing loads, people will experience it differently if we can get them to hold their breath. This is just a completely spontaneous but very common thing. And to me, what it suggested was that it's a way into exploring what turns out to be the very physical, embodied character of our relationships with information technologies. We often think of those relationships as one that is a kind of electronic or photonic circuit that goes just from the screen to our eyes and then sort of into our brains. But it's not. It's one that involves our hands, it involves our bodies, that affects our posture. And all of that stuff really matters in shaping the effect that these technologies have on us. I then talk about the value of meditation as a tool for dealing with technology-generated distraction. And the center of that chapter is a set of interviews that I did with a group of Buddhist monks and nuns who are also social media entrepreneurs.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's an interesting part of the book I'd like to hear more about.
So I had not originally envisioned building a chapter around them, but I had this amazing experience when I was doing these interviews that actually, when I was several months into it, was the thing that really convinced me that I was telling an important story. I mean, I'd always known it, but, there's knowing it and then there's really, really knowing it. And what happened was that I was interviewing them about the question of how is it that you're able to maintain the kind of rigorous practice that you've studied for years while doing things like running a YouTube channel or blogging or putting stuff up on Twitter multiple times a day. And these are people who, some of them are in North America and the US or Canada. One of them, Bhikkhu Samahita, is a forest monk who lives in Sri Lanka above a tea plantation. There's another one who lives a few miles away from Samahita. Someone else who, when I interviewed her, was studying in India and has since gone back to Canada. So, these are people who are living all over the world in all kinds of different circumstances. But when I asked them, okay, so how is it that you manage to deal with the distractions of the technology? To a person, at first, it was like they didn't understand the question. Sometimes when you're interviewing people, there are two kinds of really good experiences. There's the kind of cool conversation that comes from a real meeting of the minds where you're almost able to finish each other's sentences. And then there's the experience of asking a question that turns out to make absolutely no sense to the person you're talking to because there's some really fundamental premise that the two of you don't share. And in the course of exploring that question, of figuring out what it is that the two of you think differently about, turns out to be a real revelation. And that second experience was the one that I had with the monks, because all of them turned the question around once I made clear what I was asking. And they asked me back, why is it that you think that the technology is the problem? Distraction is something that humans have had to deal with for thousands of years. Whether you externalize it as smartphones and the internet, whether you externalize it as your job, as something else, ultimately, the ultimate source of distraction comes from inside. And that seemed to me incredibly profound insight. And it's important because what it does, I think, for us is two important things. It helps us realize that whatever we may think, the solution to these problems is within our grasp. Facebook and Twitter and smartphone companies spend enormous amounts of time and energy and money trying to figure out how to keep you on their sites a little longer, how to get you to click on just one more thing, to play one more game. And this does not absolve them of responsibility for that. I think plenty of engineers who work at those places would say, well, we're just trying to do the best job we can to make the most appealing product. And if people get addicted to it, it's not our fault. And I think they might listen to the monks and draw from this the conclusion that if people get addicted, ultimately, they only have themselves to blame, not us. Personally, I think that the more correct perspective is to recognize that you're using services, you're using technologies from companies that are trying really, really hard to commodify your attention. These are companies that are creating weapons of mass distraction that they want to use to capture your attention so they can, so that basically they can resell it to advertisers.
Stealing digital meth.
Yes. However, despite their best efforts to close off the sense that we no longer have a choice in the matter, that this kind of digital dopamine addiction is both pleasant but also inevitable. The lesson of the monks is you still have free will here. You still have a choice. You still have the ability to solve these problems yourself, to find your own way out. That, for me, was the really important takeaway from those interviews. The other thing it made me realize was that there is a line of argument about the relationship between technology and attention and culture that goes something like this. People have been complaining for thousands of years about new technologies having a negative effect on us. Socrates complained about the invention of writing. In the 1500s, there were people complaining about the printing press. The same happened with newspapers, with television, etc. And it's always the same arguments, and people eventually just deal, right? We all get over it. You just learn how to think in this new world. And what the monks made me realize is that there is a second parallel history. That yes, these complaints do come up and they do have a kind of similarity century after century, but there is a parallel history of coming up with solutions to these problems. It's not just that the people who complain get old and die. It's not that the digital natives of the 1500s, the printing press natives took over, and for them, printed books were a totally natural thing, or that the radio generation supplanted the phonograph generation, but rather that you can go back and point to active efforts to figure out how to reclaim our attention, how to use these technologies, to use these media in ways that were constructive, that sort of extended our abilities, rather than simply giving into the idea that their coming was inevitable, that their effects were predetermined, and that all that we could do was surrender to the embrace of disruptive novelty. In some ways, the world in which the Buddha lived was one that was subject to as much large-scale disruption as the world that we live in today. There was a great German historian who coined the term the axial age, which is the age in which the Greek philosophers were working. We see the rise of Buddhism. We see the sort of rise of modern ideas about ethics and philosophy in mind. And this argument was that all of this comes about as a result of great political turmoil, the rise of empires, the rise of global trade and global communications, large-scale migrations, and all kinds of disruptions that raised really fundamental questions about how we were going to live. And I think that the fact that there is more than a little similarity between the tumult of the axial age and today only reinforces why it is that a set of ideas, a set of practices that are 2,500 years old and counting are as useful today as they were back then. It's because despite all of our inventiveness and our investments in technology, there's an awful lot of stuff, including ourselves, that are still very much the same.
What is it you most hope people get out of the book?
If there is one thing that people should come away with from the book, it is the sense that they have the power to fix this themselves, that connection is inevitable, but distraction is a choice, that we're able to figure out ways of living and working with these technologies that make us the kinds of people we want to be, rather than or to force us to become kind of information consumers or continuous retweeters and oversharers. The idea that these technologies are incredibly powerful and incredibly appealing, and therefore they are irresistible, not to sound too conspiratorial, I hope, but that is what their designers want us to believe. And I think that the single biggest lesson is that we can still find ways to use these technologies to help ourselves become more mindful and more thoughtful and smarter. That's it.
So we're working on something else as well, and I want to give you a few minutes to chat about that. Tell us about rest.
Sure. One of the later chapters of Distraction Addiction talks about digital Sabbaths, which are the practice of taking a day or sometimes a week or a month and putting away all your devices, not checking your email, and going off and doing very, very different kinds of things. So I touch on some of this stuff a little bit in the previous book, but I got interested in the question of rest when I was writing The Distraction Addiction and noticed that I set for myself a really ambitious writing schedule, writing quota. And I found that I was able to work, to write really seriously, really deeply for about 4 or 5 hours, and then I was done for the day. And, I got plenty of stuff written, and I still had energy left to, do interviews or read other stuff or, kind of take care of the kind of business side of working on the book. But there was that critical kind of immersion where you are thinking about nothing but the next sentence. You've got a dozen different things in short-term memory, and you're playing with the prose, and you're moving stuff around, and you're figuring out how to craft that argument. That really intensive kind of work was something that I could do for about 4 or 5 hours. And I wondered, am I just slow? Am I getting old? Or what? And I started looking just kind of idly at the schedules of a few other really creative people whose biographies I just happen to have in my library, and realized, when you look, for example, at Charles Darwin, the father of the theory of evolution by natural selection, the guy who wrote 17 or 18 books, depending on how you count some of them, the guy who revolutionized the way that we think about species, the way we think about our place in the world. He worked about 5 hours a day, 4 or 5 really intensive hours. And you can see the same thing with writers as different as Hemingway and Stephen King. You can see it with scientists, with artists, all kinds of super creative and super productive people. Now, it turns out, of course, someone like Darwin, he puts down his pen at noon and he goes for a long walk for a couple hours. But he very clearly is thinking about this stuff all the time, right? These ideas are turning over in his mind. And in fact, he builds a walking path so that he has a place to go and walk and think. But if he were, a young professor someplace, and someone looked at his schedule, looked at how much time he was at his desk, they would sit him down and have a really serious conversation with him because it looks like he's not working very much. So I found that, first of all, really reassuring. If Darwin and Hemingway put in 4 hours a day and they did all this stuff, then maybe there's hope for me. But it also got me interested in the question of, okay, what is it that these guys are doing the other 20 hours of the day? And women, this is also this kind of pattern is also true for Jane Austen and Simone de Beauvoir and lots of other folks. And are there things that we can learn from their 4-hour days that in today's constant 24/7 world can help us understand how to work better? Our reigning presumption is that the more hours you can put in at the office, the more productive you're going to be, right? The more you work, the more you're going to get done. And the tantalizing suggestion of these lives is that that formulation is wrong. That in some way, if you want to be more creative, if you want to be more innovative, the key is not to learn how to work harder, but to learn how to rest better. And so what I'm exploring is the question of, what does that kind of rest look like? And it turns out that it has certain kinds of patterns. First of all, it's often a very physical sort of rest. Charles Dickens, for example, he was incredibly disciplined about his work. He spent 4 hours every day at his desk, whether he produced a single word or not, and then he would go for a walk. And not just any walk. He would walk for 10 miles, very often with a gigantic, fierce-looking dog because he was walking through and it was kind of dangerous. But he was by no means unusual in putting in 60 or 70 miles a week on the road. And this for him was his rest. Very often for these people, their idea of rest is more strenuous than our idea of exercise. And what I'm finding is that they practice what I've come to think of as deliberate rest. You may know from Malcolm Gladwell this idea of deliberate practice, and people who are world-class performers or programmers spend 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, and then they become really good. Well, the person who did that, who coined the term deliberate practice, sociologist named Anders Ericsson. And in the article that first talks about this, where he coins the term deliberate practice, he observes, just kind of as an aside, that the people who do this, the people who put in the 10,000 hours over 10 years, which, by the way, if you assume that they don't do this on weekends and they take 2 weeks off every year, that 10,000 hours over 10 years works out to 1,000 hours a year, or 4 hours a day. This is not a coincidence, I think. But Just as an aside, Anders noted that they get more sleep than other students at the Berlin Conservatory that they were studying, and also that they didn't rest a lot more, but they were much more conscious of how much time they rested. And what I'm finding is that people like Darwin and Einstein and Hemingway and many of these other creative types discover what I call deliberate rest, which is a kind of a parallel to deliberate practice. They're mindful about it, they're regular with it, and they learn to do it in ways that are both mentally and physically restorative, but do it in ways that allow their subconscious minds to keep working on problems. And that, I think, is a kind of under-recognized or under-acknowledged key that sort of runs through the lives of virtually all of these people. And so what I'm trying to do now is uncover the kind of neuroscience and neurology behind deliberate rest and to explain why it is that practices like long walks, like digital Sabbaths, regular long vacations, why those, when practiced right, when practiced properly, can help you be more creative and help you get more done than you would if you fill out the world's biggest prescription for Adderall and you have catered lunches brought to your office for a solid year and you don't see your family. The assumption, especially here in Silicon Valley, is that that kind of stuff is how you build the next Facebook, how you invent Web 4.0 or whatever number we're up to now. Call me crazy, but I think that people like Shakespeare and Einstein and King Sejong the Great of Korea, the guy who invents the modern Korean writing system, Hangul, that these people maybe knew some stuff about how to get creative work done that we ought to pay attention to. And so the REST project is an effort to catalog what they did and to provide some scientific understanding of why those practices worked so that we can learn to construct our own versions.
Sounds like very interesting work. I'm eager to hear more about that in the future. And for folks who are listening, I'll be linking to 3 sites that are around Alex's work. First is contemplativecomputing.org, and then distractionaddiction.com, directly related to the book we've been talking about today. And then for the new project, deliberate.rest. Our guest today has been Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. Alex, thank you for being here.
It's been a pleasure, Ted. Thank you all.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monte Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.